All the Young Dudes by MsKingBean89, Chapter 125, 7th Year, Christmas Part 2. The ground shook, and Remus squeezed his eyes shut, belly down on the cobblestones. Everything after that moment, seeing Lily and James's heads turn, before the building in front of them exploded, everything after that made so little sense. It was all too slow, or too fast, and Remus found he did not react in his usual way. He was weak, frightened, his comprehension muddled. He felt stunned. They raised their heads, he and Sirius, much too long after it had gone quiet, when people around them were already standing up and were shouting or crying. Someone was definitely crying, a woman. That seemed loudest of all. And someone laughing too, a thin, razor-sharp cackle in the distance, pure joy. Diagon Alley looked like a bomb site. The shops which had been destroyed were like broken teeth in a gaping maw, strange blue patches of sky where something else should be. It was hard to see much on ground level, but they squinted through the settling dust further down the street towards Gringotts, where most of the noise seemed to be coming from. "You two!" a woman hissed, coming towards them from behind, picking through the rubble, a wand raised. "Get back! Behind me!" She stalked ahead. Her robes were deep maroon, and Aura's uniform. "James!" Sirius choked, his voice strange and strangled with terror. He scrambled to his feet, his robes all dusty and his hair full of soot. He half ran, half stumbled, towards the hole in the sky where the Quidditch supply shop had stood minutes before. "Sirius, no!" Remus coughed, weakly, following him, feeling stupid and heavy. "James!" Sirius was shouting, but so many people were shouting. "Sirius!" Remus coughed again, trying hard to keep up, but he'd bruised his hip when he'd hit the ground, and his ears were still ringing, and his eyes were starting to go blurry as he wiped away tears with dusty wrists. "Sirius!" "Mudblood's out!" Remus dropped to his knees, covering his ears, and he was not the only one. The voice seemed to be right behind him, inside his head. It was everywhere. The crowd was silent, finally, as everyone stared around, blinking, looking for the owner of the horrible, insidious voice. Whatever was going on was happening further away. Remus could smell magic now, and see beams of light firing through the dust clouds surrounding Gringotts. He could smell Moody and Ferox? Maybe him. And the Death Eaters. Some of them he recognised, others he didn't, but they were there, and there were a lot of them. Where was Sirius? The ruins of the shop which had stood before them were still bleeding smoke, and Sirius had wandered straight into it, the idiot. Gritting his teeth, and with not a little pain, Remus pushed himself to his feet again. He had to find them. The shouts of battle were getting louder, more desperate. The woman who had ordered him and Sirius back had joined in, and Remus's conscience told him he ought to go and help. But James, and Lily, and Sirius... "More's murder!" the same voice spoke, close and far away. The smoke filling the street seemed to writhe and darken, expanding and swirling upwards to form an enormous snake entwined with a screaming, hollow-eyed black skull. "It's him!" a man near Remus shouted. "It's you-know-who!" "Silencio!" Someone else sexed him into quiet. An odd stillness, more flashes, blue, green, yellow, red, and then crack, crack, crack. They were getting away! For the first time, Remus thought to withdraw his wand, fumbling about in his borrowed robes for it. As he did, his fingers brushed against something else, smooth and heavy. His fingers closed around his pocket watch, and he wrenched it out, prizing it open quickly and saying aloud, "Sirius Black." The needle did not even wobble, but pointed forward immediately, and Remus followed it towards the ruin of the shop. "Sirius? Sirius?" "Mooney!" Anne grabbed his shoulder, and he whipped around desperately. "James!" James hugged him fiercely, and Remus didn't even think about how unusual it was. He was just so grateful and relieved. He hugged him back. Lily appeared at his shoulder, pale-faced, her hair falling out of its ponytail, clothes smudged with ash. There was a cut just under her hairline, dark blood oozing down her left eyebrow. And Sirius Chew, "Thank God, thank God, thank God." "I lost you," Remus said, hoarsely, once James let him go. One of the lenses in his glasses was shattered. "I'm sorry," Sirius said, sounding just as awful. "We'd better go and help," James said, shaking both their shoulders. "The battle's finished," Remus said. "They ran away. This separated most of them." "How did you chew?" He stared at Lily and James, still not quite believing his eyes. "Frank," Lily said, sounding much smaller than Remus had ever heard her. James wrapped an arm around her. "Frank's an aura. He used a knockback jinx on us, right before the shot hit. Then Protego, I think. I didn't know what to do." Her eyes filled with tears, and James wrapped his other arm around her, enveloping her completely. "I didn't either," Remus said, as if it would help. "Didn't even get my wand out." Sirius was gripping his, though. He looked dreadful, fierce as a demon, eyes full of hatred. "I'm going anyway. They might still need help," he said. Remus grabbed him by the shoulders, surprising even himself with his strength. "Don't you dare," he growled, meeting Sirius's eye. Something distinctly canine passed between them then, and Remus almost thought they were going to actually fight, and that would be sort of a relief if they did. But of course, James intervened. "Mooney's right," he said. "We ought to—" Crack! "Boys! Dad!" Fleamont Potter had arrived right next to James. He grabbed his son, then Sirius, then Remus, who had recovered enough now to find the hugging all a bit much, and then stared with horror at what remained of Diagon Alley. His bushy eyebrows knit, and he addressed his son. "Are you okay? Your mother wants you all back at the house immediately. She's been called to St. Mungo's. Otherwise, she'd be here." "Shouldn't we stay and help?" James asked, looking troubled, still holding Lily tight to his chest. What a bloody hero, Remus thought. He still had Sirius by the shoulders, gripping him hard, because he couldn't hug him. Fleamont looked at James, and seemed to grow a few inches with pride. He smiled. "No, son, it's all in hand. Moody's there, and Dumbledore's on his way. I just want you all home and safe, before anything—" "No one is to leave," a man was shouting, cutting through the crowd in the rubble with an authoritative stride. "Not until they have been questioned by—" "Oh, hello, Monty. Didn't know you were here." "Amos," Mr. Potter nodded at the ministry official. "Got here as soon as I could. Taking the boys home. They were out shopping and got caught up." "That's so?" The official, Amos, came over to look at them. "Names?" "Amos, is that really "Names?" he repeated, in an harder tone. "Well, you know James. You've known him since he was 5, for goodness sake," Fleamont tutted. "And this is Miss Evans, I presume?" He glanced at Lily, who had stopped crying, but still looked very frightened. "Yes," she squeaked. "Lily Evans." "Evans?" Amos looked thoughtful. He pulled some parchment out of his pocket. Evans. Parents' names?" "You wouldn't know them," she said, her eyes darting between James and the official. "I'm Muggleborn." Amos looked down his nose at her, then eyed James with a rude quirk of his eyebrow. "I see. Very well. And you two?" "Oh, ho! I know you. You're the Black Heir." "Was," Sirius muttered. He shook himself free of Remus and shoved his hands in his pockets, adopting a sullen, irritable attitude which always appeared when his family was mentioned. Remus wished he could tell him not to do that. It didn't make him look any less guilty. "He's coming home with us too," Fleamont said, quickly. "Sirius has lived with us for well over a year now, and—" "Come on, Monty," Amos stuttered. "The Black Heir? I'm not stupid, and neither are you. He'll have to be questioned." "Absolutely not!" Fleamont raised his voice. Remus had never heard him shout before. It was even more terrifying than a dark mark. "They're school kids, for Godric's sake!" "Plenty of school kids on their side too, from what I hear," Amos said. "Plenty of blacks too." "I'm not interested in that. You can speak with Dumbledore if you have to, but I am responsible for these boys, and I'm taking them home right now." "What about you?" Amos suddenly turned on Remus, who blinked. Sometimes he forgot that the Potters included him in their responsibilities. "Remus," he said, trying to be brave, but failing miserably. "What if this man knows something? What if he knows I'm a werewolf? Lupin." "Humph," Amos made a note, but asked no further questions. "You're all to wait here while I speak with Dumbledore," he said, pompously. "Like hell we will," Fleamont snorted. "If you want to go and interrupt Albus Dumbledore while he assists the investigation of a terrorist attack for the sake of a few frightened teenagers, then—" "Amos, someone— was it really Frank?" shouted from the distance. "Where the hell are you? We need you up here. It's Leo." The official turned, sharply, and with a reluctant final glance at Sirius, he ran towards the voice. Mr. Potter leapt into action, taking no chances. "Quick, boys! Are you all okay to apparate? Miss Evans, probably best if you come on with us for now." Lily nodded, and James kissed her, before they both disapparated together, hand in hand. Fleamont nodded at Sirius and Remus, before vanishing with a loud crack himself. Remus looked at Sirius. Sirius looked at him too, still angry, still full of a hot desire for revenge. "Oh no," Remus said, firmly. Then, barely even thinking about it, grabbed Sirius's elbow, hard, and prepared to apparate with him. Sirius fought it mid-turn. The stupid fool could have easily splinched them, as he strained against Remus's spell, wanting only to stay where the fight was. But Remus was stronger. The air was full of fizzing, roaring leftover magic, and Remus drank from it, overpowering Sirius with the sheer weight of his own determination. They arrived on the Potter's front porch with such a force their heads banged together, and they wrenched apart, panting, feeling scorched. "Fucking hell, Mooney!" Sirius gasped, rubbing his elbow where Remus had grabbed him. "Had to stop you, idiot!" Remus bent forward, hands on his knees. He felt completely drained, but buzzing with it, nerves alight with static. James opened the door. "Get inside," he said, quickly. Sirius pushed past Remus without looking at him. Lily stayed for another hour or so, drinking cup after cup of tea, as Gully scuffed back and forth from the kitchen, wringing his little wizened hands and shaking his head woefully. Mr. Potter apologised profusely to Lily, and hoped they would meet again soon under better circumstances, before locking himself away in his study. After that, they sat in silence for most of the time, with only the occasional outburst from James or Sirius. "Snape!" Sirius ranted, pacing back and forth. "We saw him in the bookshop. He threatened Mooney. He must have had something to do with it." "You don't know that," Lily said, shakily, staring at the pattern in her teacup. "Did anyone see any of them, though?" "No," James shook his head. "Too busy trying to take cover." "No," Lily shook her head. "No," Remus said. Sirius looked up at him. "Mooney, you smelled something. You told me, remember? Do you know who—" "Remus, you can smell people?" Lily looked up, half shocked, half curious. "Like a scent?" "Not like... It's just a wolf thing. Instinct. But I don't..." Remus wished the ground would swallow him up. He could tell them, but he didn't want to break it to Sirius like this. Not where they were furious at each other and frightened, and Lily and James were sitting right there. "Mooney," Sirius said, in a very low, dark voice that none of them had ever heard before. "Tell me, who?" Remus looked at James, desperately for help, but he was just staring back, waiting. Lily too, her mouth slightly open. He looked at Sirius again and tried to hold his stare. "I think Regulus was there. But lots of people were there, Sirius." Sirius threw his hands up and he left the room in utter silence. Lily gave a very tired sigh. "James," she said, "I think I had better go home. Mum and Dad will wonder." James insisted on apparating back with Lily, then returning by himself. Remus wished he hadn't. He didn't want to be left alone. Alone, it all came flooding back into his mind, as vivid as a cinema screen. The noise, the smoke, the utter terror, and shame. He had not acted. His first chance to prove to Dumbledore and Moody, and even Snivellus, that he was on the right side and willing to fight for it. But he had never expected it to be like that. Had never considered that when the time came, and you were on a battlefield with the only people you love in the world, all he'd wanted to do was find them and run away. When James returned, he found Remus pacing, treading the same stretch of carpet Sirius had been on earlier. "Are you okay, Moony?" he asked, nervously, taking slow steps forward, arms up, as if Remus was an untamed beast. "I didn't do anything," Remus muttered, still pacing. I couldn't move. I couldn't think." "Remus," James kept speaking in that steady, friendly tone. It was more soothing than Remus wanted to admit. "Nobody could. It was horrible. It's the scariest thing that ever happened." Remus stopped dead and stared at James. He gave a half smile and shrugged. "None of us knew what to do." "Sirius did," Remus challenged. "He was the one who got up. He wanted to help." "Sirius never thinks, though, Moony. You know that." "Aye, up yours." Sirius suddenly appeared in the doorway, arms folded. His eyes were a bit pink, but he didn't look angry anymore. Remus smiled at him, hopefully, behind James's back. Sirius smiled back reassuringly. "I was going to say," James laughed, "that's what makes you so brave, you wanker. You just want to rush in and help, even if it's the worst idea in the world." "Yes, okay, it was not a good idea," Sirius said, sitting down on the sofa beside James. "At least you did something," Remus said. "At least you got up." "You got up too, Remus," Sirius said, softly. "After you did," Remus shot back. "I was pathetic. How are we ever going to win this war if it's going to be like that? If I'm too scared to—" "I was scared too," Sirius said, looking up. "I'm not that bonkers. I was still bricking it. Fucking hell." "Don't," James said, running his hand through his hair, still gritty with rubble. "It took me so long to even figure out what happened, and all I could think about was getting Lily somewhere safe. I thought I would just do anything to make sure she was safe." "There you are then," Sirius said, firmly. "That's how we win it." Mrs. Potter did not come back from St. Mungo's all night, but Fleamont stepped out of his office to tell the boys he had spoken to her and that she was all right, before asking Gully to make him a sandwich and closing the door again. Peter came over, bright and shaken. He had heard the news. Apparently he had a cousin working for the Daily Prophet. There was no useful information, though. No death count yet. It hadn't been finalised. Peter stayed for supper, but James was the only one really able to keep up a proper conversation, and eventually Peter left. When Remus announced he wanted an early night, the other two shrugged and agreed to go up too. After showering and washing the dust and smoke out of his hair, he brushed his teeth in the cold, quiet bathroom and tried not to think about how odd it felt to be doing such normal things on such an abnormal day. He could hear Sirius and James murmuring quietly in the next room, solemn, tense tones. He decided to leave them to it. Hours later, Remus was seriously regretting that decision. He couldn't sleep. He waited and waited for Sirius to come, until he realised that he must still be in with James, and might not come at all. Remus lay on his back and tried to keep his thoughts from getting too loud. "This war," he kept thinking. "This is what you agreed to do. You promised Dumbledore. You promised your friends." Finally, in the small hours, when he was sick from tiredness and the first pink rays of sunrise were peeking out from the curtains, his door opened. Sirius crept across the room with the stealth of a cat. "Remus," he whispered from the foot of the bed. Remus rolled over. "I'm here." Sirius practically flew at him, sliding in under the covers and burying his head under the duvet. They clung to each other, and everything steadied itself. Remus was calm at last. In a moment, Sirius moved slightly and whispered, "Tell me a secret, a nice one." Remus paused. He kissed Sirius's hair. I'm mental about you, Chew.